Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining this Nikkei Asia live webinar on Enriching Asia, Women's Wealth Reaches Record Highs. We've got a great panel today with us, and I would like to introduce them. Jui Chakraborty is the Special Project Editor of Nikkei Asia. We have Lien Huang, staff writer at Nikkei Asia, based in Vietnam. And we have Sisi Zhao, who is Senior Business Correspondent at Nikkei Asia, based in Hong Kong, and Shayan Chakraborty, who is a business reporter based in India. And I'm Michael Peel. I am the executive of Nikkei Asia. So we've got a lot to discuss today on this topic, which was reported from around Asia, right across the region, primarily from Bangladesh, China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, the Philippines, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam, as well as the United States. Took several months of work, looks visually stunning, and involved 15 reporters, yielding a 5-part series, which came out at the end of last year. So I'd like to start by asking Jui, why did you pick up this subject of women's wealth in Asia as the subject for this series?
Hi, good evening. So for the first time in history, women in Asia now hold more combined wealth than any other region except North America. And that total is growing faster than anywhere else in the world. So women in Asia, ex-Japan, because all the data tends to be ex-Japan, will hold $27 trillion of wealth by 2026. That's $6 trillion more than women in Western Europe, according to an analysis done by BCG for Nikkei. And it found that women's combined wealth in Asia overtook that of Western Europe just at the end of last year. And the numbers, they're not small. Women in Asia have been adding $2 trillion to their collective wealth annually since 2019. And also the rate of growth, it's a heady 10.6%. And it's predicted to continue that way for at least the next 4 years. So it seemed like a moment where, we should examine the data, spotlight the progress, but also delve into the nuances, the ironies, the challenges that in very deep, fundamental ways are still holding back what is essentially half the region's population. So we had an excellent data journalist, Shreya Raman, who is not on the panel today, mine and analyze a bunch of data. And we found that basically over the past few decades, new technology, globalization, and market-oriented reform have stoked economic growth for women, but also widened inequality. So, for example, female billionaires in Asia increased from 13 in 2010 to 92 last year. Women's share of total labor income going up everywhere except China. We looked at the factors that are driving the progress, and we found things like fertility rates, which have been falling across Asia. Age at first marriage for women, that has been going up across the region. Tertiary school enrollment also been trending up. But at the same time, 75% of women in the region still work in the informal sector, where employment is often precarious, wages are lower, there is no access to social protection. And then we looked at things like gender wealth gap at retirement. In Asia, women are expected to accumulate not even 72, I think, percent of the wealth that men would accumulate at retirement. So we decided to do this 5-part series, and each segment explores the journey that Asia is going through on gender. Each one is told through a specific lens and spans the superlatives that we see at both ends of the spectrum. So maybe we can hear from the lead reporters on each piece. Thank you.
Thanks, Jui, for setting that up. And as you say, that this data piece led into three long thematically based pieces. And the first was about certain industries, certain fields that had historically been very close to women, and how women in these very varied fields were actually breaking into them in ways which benefited not just pioneer women, but also potentially drove institutional change, which helped generations of women to come. Lien, you were very closely involved in this piece and wrote it. Could you tell us a bit about the big picture here? What did you look at? How did you choose which fields, which women to look at, and what did you find?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Hello from sunny Saigon, everyone. So for this segment of the series, we were focusing on industries. We were looking for industries that are sort of seen traditionally as the province of men. And we were finding a lot of women who were either rising up in those industries or just by merely entering them were making a mark. And so that led us to interviewing women who were working as pilots, either in the military or commercially, as engineers in the all-important semiconductor chip industry, talking to women who are pro athletes, professional cricketers, but also, you know, this isn't necessarily about wealthy women, despite the name. The idea was more to showcase women's collective wealth. And so we did want to talk to more blue collar workers as well. I wish we'd had more room. We featured taxi drivers, for example, and if we'd had more room, we could have talked to construction workers or coders or factory managers. Those are the kinds of people you see a lot in Vietnam, where I am, for example, a lot of women doing these jobs. And so that was sort of our starting point. And if you haven't seen the series yet, I just loved going back through it and looking at the photos and the videos that the team put together, because they are really just amazing to see what the women are doing. So as we interviewed them, we really wanted to understand from these women the drivers, the causes that were enabling them to get into these industries, and support their advancement, essentially. And one thing that we kept coming back to a lot, no matter what the sector was, a common discussion point was family, and children in particular. And so the issue in Asia, I mean, I guess it's the issue everywhere, but for women in Asia, first, it's a question of, do they have a right to choose if they're going to have children, and when? And once they do have children, who's taking care of them? And I think the reason this kept coming up in our conversations was that in Asia, there are a couple of sort of regional factors. One kind of controversially is the issue of abortion, that the rates of abortion are higher in a lot of these countries, and so, you know, it's a bit controversial, and it's a very complex topic that we've written about in past articles. But one of the byproducts of that is that women are less likely to have to quit the workforce because of an unplanned pregnancy. And then beyond that, I think the more common issue was about family support in general. Once women did decide to have children, a lot of the people we interviewed talked about either having 3-generation households, which are very common in Asia, that enabled the women to have careers, or having more affordable nannies or domestic help. And so that's been a huge factor as well. Oh, I think,
Yeah.
Michael, you're on mute.
I'm so sorry. I guess that's not an option that's open to everybody, right? Because you need a certain amount of money to be able to afford help. Did you find that actually state provision in many of the countries you looked at was not good?
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets to the bigger picture. So, on the one hand, we have women. For example, one of the commercial pilots we interviewed in India. She said, you know, we revolve around the family in India. That sort of human bond is missing in the West. And she made a point that that her husband helped a lot in dividing up domestic duties, and that she expects her extended family would help a lot once she had children. But a lot of these women were not talking about the bigger social safety net, say having a systemic sort of childcare option, or having a top-down sort of policy-driven option. And so the options that they did talk about instead were more driven from the bottom up, from what choices were available to them.
And who? I mean, give us a bit of a sense of the personalities here. Which ones? Which woman would you pick from the piece who really struck you? Whose example you think is really illustrates some of the points that we're talking about? Could you tell a little story?
Well, I think that the women were sort of conflicted because a lot of them, on the one hand, they wanted to say that you know, they are where they are. You know, they've risen to the top of a company, or through the Air Force, through merit, through their own personal efforts, and they didn't want to be seen as you know, getting extra favor because they were women. But at the same time, we were also interviewing women who would say, you know, there does need to be a concerted effort to get more people like me into this industry. And I think a good example of that, I forget the name of the woman in India. I don't know if Julie, you remember, but there was I think she was the first fighter pilot, was it? Who was obviously early in the industry, and she did not have the same benefits as the men who were rising up through the Air Force, and so she took her case to court and basically won a case that allowed women to have full-time commissions, as men did, as opposed to part-time, which is a big deal. It leads to having pensions and other benefits that women were not getting before. And so she was a clear pioneer in, you know, the effort that she put into her career obviously had a lot of after effects for the generations who came after her.
Yeah, Brett, I also thought that was a pretty incredible story, Leanne. I think her name was Wing Commander Namrata Chandi. And I don't know if we have a photo of hers to show here, but she was the daughter of a farmer and the first woman in her family to earn a paycheck ever. And yeah, I think she was the second batch of combat helicopter pilots in the Indian Air Force. And as you pointed out, she served for 15 years before being forced to retire because women were only allowed short service commissions. And so this also meant that aside from having no career path, that she got no pension. And this was the case for all of the women in the defense forces in India. And so she went to court, and I think it was an 8-year battle in the Supreme Court of India just this year, in fact, well, we're now in 23. So last year ruled that the defense forces must allow women to become permanently commissioned officers. And so this is something that, you know, Michael, you pointed out at the beginning of the session. It's something that changes the game for several future generations of women. And that's where sort of women breaking in takes on, you know, more profound meaning, because you know, not only are they not only now do you have a whole new slew of paychecks that previously didn't exist for women, but it also means that women are coming into these spaces and pushing them to think about women, and through that pushing for institutional change. And also, you know, to your point about systemic security, there definitely, you know, there isn't much there yet. There's, you know, the countries as a whole and these professions and companies within these spaces, you know, I know it's sometimes difficult to believe that in 2023, women are new to a lot of these industries, but they are. And so these are spaces that just have not had to, you know, think about women up until now. So we, you know, we featured in this piece professional cricketers. So these were women who were on the first national women's teams of sports like cricket in their countries. And basically what we have now is a vicious circle, right? Because it's commerce. So nobody really knows about women players, and women players are not sponsored. They're not even given clothing or shoes or gear, let alone accommodation and flights for travel, because no one watches their games. And you know, the cricketers we spoke with, they talked about how they funded their own play basically for several years. There's no money coming in for them, and so there's no money going to them. So that basically, you know, that needs to change to a virtuous circle where you actually fund women in professional sport. So then they in turn can actually perform well, you market them, and you build an audience for the matches. The graphic that you're seeing now, for example, that is a cricket viewership just in India of the most watched men's match versus the most watched women's match. So you can see that gap, right? It is just gargantuan. So, you know, but we have seen plenty of spaces around the world in professional sport where things have worked out well when women are in fact funded. And now you have these South Asian countries. India just announced a degree of pay parity for women cricketers last year. And Pakistan and Bangladesh, they're looking at launching franchise leagues, professional leagues this year. So that would put women, you know, another step closer to groups like the Indian Premier League for men, which has lured players, it's lured profits to the sport. And it will also help build grassroots level talent and help more money come into the sport. So that's one of the things we were able to do through this piece, is not just spotlight women who are pioneering and paving the way, which is also important because representation is so important, and it's important for younger women out there to see women in spaces that maybe they're not expected to be seen in. But we were able to talk to these women about how change is occurring and also what really needs to happen to sort of make this, you know, sustainable and viable, and help it really scale in the long run, because we are half of the world's population, we are half of Asia's population, and you know, this can only be good for everybody in the long run.
Yeah, and in terms of what to do, if I could just add, I want to highlight one other person we interviewed, a woman in Vietnam. And she made the point that, you know, where I saw her was at this conference for women, which was maybe 89% women. And she made the point that, you know, we should not ghettoize this issue as if it should just, you know, as if feminism needs to mean that, you know, you just want women to get ahead. And her point was that, you know, gender inequality also hurts men because to quote her, she says, you know, these gender equality talks happen between women and not men, and it's important to figure out how to get men involved and get their perspectives. And they also bear tremendous social biases. For example, being expected to be the sole or main breadwinner, or to have enough money or assets to find a wife, etc. That was the way she put it. And so I think it's important, yeah, to not just have these conversations among ourselves, and to also explain why it's a broader issue.
That's so true, right? And it ends up hurting men as well, as you said, and also most of the decision makers, whether it's in policy or whether it's in the corporate world, are still men, and so you know we do need them to be active allies. The one other point I was reminded of from your piece, Lian, is sort of the dichotomy that exists even within countries. You know, like. I remember we talked about airline pilots in India and how it's an outlier. Like 12.5% of the pilot workforce in India, the commercial pilot workforce, is female. And when you look at, you know, more developed countries like the US, where in fact the pilot workforce is much larger, but only 5% is female. In the UK, only 5% is female. And yet India is a country that ranks 135 out of 146 in the World Economic Forum's rankings of nations based on gender parity. So India lags basically in everything. It lags in labor force participation, in healthcare, and female to male literacy ratio, income equality, representation in politics, technical and leadership roles. And yet it's a huge outlier when it comes to airline pilots. It's also important to recognize and remember that gender dynamics, you know, there's vast diversity in how it manifests even within each countries, and of course in various parts of Asia, based on geography and socioeconomic caste and industries as well.
Yeah, and if I could just leave with maybe a few practical things that we found in the reporting, which was, you know, whatever your position about this issue, I think companies and organizations have found ways to get closer to equity. And so there were, you know, just some basic small examples, like companies talked about having networking and training events at times that accommodate working parents, for example. And I think, you know, I talk to a lot of men who say, well, you know, I don't want to have affirmative action. I don't want to have quotas that, you know, women need to be 50% of the board or the workforce. But that kind of assumes that we live in a meritocracy. But you know, we find study after study showing that when you anonymize, for example, hiring, when you anonymize resumes, candidates, then women and also actually ethnic minorities tend to be hired more often, which just demonstrates that, you know, there may not be outright sexism, but implicit bias continues to affect the way we work and hire. And so that's one strategy that has worked for a lot of organizations, is trying to remove factors that could bias decision making.
Thank you both, and that was a fascinating tour through this subject, and as Julie said, it really highlighted the way that this is a very nuanced discussion, that countries can be doing quite well, in some relatively well, but by the fairly low standards of female representation in many fields, in some fields, but very poorly in others. And I think that's one of the themes of the series that really emerged and will continue to be developed in this discussion. The second piece was the second large piece in this series was about finance, and we at Nikkei Asia turned our attention to female founders of startup companies, and the struggles that many of them had faced to get the kind of investor interest that male counterparts had got. Cheyenne, do you want to just give us a tour of what you looked at and what you found here?
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and hello, everyone. So I'll start with two sets of data points. According to data, businesses run by women return double the money than those run by men for every dollar invested. Which means women run amazing businesses, and investors should be lining up to invest in companies run by women. Now, on the other hand, in 2021, which was which was like saw a glut of VC funding, venture capital funding in startups. In India, there were 1,600 deals done, out of which only 47 deals involved startups that were founded only by women, which is abysmally low. In value terms of the total funds raised by women only founding teams, it was about 0.3% of what went into Indian startups. The numbers are equally bad for Southeast Asia. As you can see, only 3.9% of the startups that raised funds in Southeast Asia were founded by women-only teams, and then in terms of funds raised, it was 0.6%. Similarly, in the US, it was 2.4%. And bear in mind, all this was happening in 2021, which was an exceptional year for fundraisers in the startup ecosystem. So that got us thinking. These were very confounding sets of numbers, and that got us thinking. And we started talking to a lot of women entrepreneurs to understand what exactly was happening, why there was a slowdown in funding. Like, aren't there enough women entrepreneurs who want to start up, or investors are just not interested? If so, why? And then at one point, it seemed like we kind of opened a Pandora's box. I mean, all that we heard were stories of biases. I mean, limitations enforced by unfounded biases, so on and so forth. So I'll give you an example. For instance, there is this entrepreneur in India called Bhavna Suresh, who runs a startup called 10 Club, which is an e-commerce marketplace aggregator. And she's the CEO of the company. Now, Bhavna raised 40 million in a mix of equity and debt for her first funding round, which is great news, like a lot of money. But as soon as she raised the funds, some well-wishers advised her to step down from the CEO role and bring in a male CEO. And Bhavna was obviously surprised, like, why so? What she was told was a lot of her competitors had also raised funds, all raised by men. That a man stands a better chance at raising funds than women. Bhavna was stuck, but again, this thing is actually backed by data. There is this study by IFC, International Finance Corporation, which is a World Bank arm, which says 30% of the startups which had raised funds with a woman at helm, they replaced the female CEO with a male founder, a male CEO, for the subsequent fundraise, which is very confounding. Then there is Vanessa Hendriadi, who's the CEO of an Indonesian co-working startup called GoWorks. Vanessa's husband is a venture capital executive. So when Vanessa showed her husband the first pitch deck she had prepared for VCs, she was told, like, this kind of won't hold water before venture capital investors because, it was too conservative. Now, all Vanessa wanted to run was a profitable business which grows sustainably. Her initial idea was to set up 5 co-working spaces and run them profitably. But what her venture capital husband told was VCs want lofty projections, big numbers, which kind of justifies the valuations, and VCs make money when valuations grow. And her goals were not lucrative enough for VCs. And this was, again, very surprising for Vanessa, because all her life she comes from a family of business people, and she has seen businesses grow sustainably, profitably, and she was also kind of wonderstruck, like, what's happening. So if you look at such examples, it kind of brings to the fore the inherent biases the women face, and most of the women entrepreneurs we spoke to says we kind of talk in a different way, present things in a different way. It's not like we want to show you the moon and then deliver on something which was way below that we promised, because we already carry a baggage. Like, people are skeptical about our success, so we make sure we don't promise you 10 and then deliver 2. We would rather promise you 7 and deliver 7. So this is the bias part. There is another issue. Like if you look at the ecosystem, the venture and startup world, it's not that just startups founded by women aren't getting funded. The other part of the story is there aren't enough women in venture capital firms who are decision makers, who are partners, or who are general partners, for that matter. And what happens because of that? And I'll give you data again. Like in Southeast Asia, about 77% of the VC firms don't have a female partner, and the number is 65% in the US, which is the hotbed of venture capital in the world. So what ends up happening, according to many entrepreneurs, is the male VCs oftentimes don't understand the products they are trying to pitch, particularly if it caters to women, children, women's health, so on and so forth. And that kind of scuttles their chances. Like, people talk about venture capital being a boys' club. Boys have their cigar clubs and their golf clubs, or they kind of network, get to know each other, get comfortable with each other, and that is when the money follows. But that's not the case with women. I'll let Juhi talk about this company called Loeffler, which is a fashion startup based in New York. Juhi has kind of worked in New York for quite some time and has experienced the product. So, Juhi, if you want to kind of talk about Sarah's experience with fundraising, which kind of brings in that network issue and biases that she faced.
Yeah, thanks, Shayan. And I feel like no matter how often I hear those statistics, I find them just still as staggering. The fact that of the total VC funds raised last year, which, as you pointed out, was a really good year for raising money, less than 1% of them went to female-founded companies in India, less than 1% in Southeast Asia, and just about 2% in the US. And so, as you say, basically, there's one of the big problems is that there is a severe underrepresentation of women even on the other side, right? So when it comes to partners, when it comes to decision makers in the LP community or the VC community, there's very few of them. So women are usually pitching to men. And this has obviously ripple effects across the ecosystem because people tend to back people who think and act like them, who look like them. They tend to hire people that way, as Leon pointed out. Even with hiring, when you anonymize the resumes, the results are very different. And it's the same way with funding founders. And then you have the added layer of men just often missing the value of startups founded by women, the value of those ideas, and particularly those that maybe target women consumers. So the company you talked about, Shayan, Loeffler. So the founder, her name is Sarah Miyazawa Loeffler. She grew up in Japan. She's based in the US. Her mother is the daughter of a former prime minister of Japan, and her father is a former US ambassador. And so she has pedigree. And she went to elite schools and she worked at Bain. So she had as much of a network as really, a woman at that stage in life would have. And even for her, she talked to us about how for 5 years after she started this office apparel brand for women, she failed to raise venture capital. So in pitch after pitch after pitch, she shared research about how women spent 10 to 15 more days a year, 10 to 15 more days a year getting dressed for work than men do. So she came up with this idea of having, curated capsules that were just sent to women that you could just sort of put together and put on. And none of the people she pitched to, and she said they were all men, none of them were willing to sort of invest in the idea. They didn't understand it. They said it was too niche. And she sort of used her personal savings to get this off the ground. At the same time, she said several men's underwear startups were raising millions of dollars, people with similar backgrounds to her. But by the time the pandemic struck, her company, MM.LaFleur, was bringing in $70 million a year. So I think, this goes to show also why it is important to have women in that part of the ecosystem as well. Vanessa Hendriotti, the person that Shayon mentioned, who founded a co-working space, went through, a similar experience. She did, she did, on her husband's advice, make her pitch deck a little bit more aggressive. But when she was trying to raise money for this co-working startup, you had Adam Neumann, who was also raising money for a company we now all know of called WeWork. And WeWork eventually raised about $14 billion from hallowed investors, including Japan's SoftBank, while Vanessa struggled to raise money. And then in the years that followed, as Vanessa built a profitable company, Neumann was forced out of the company after several instances of mismanagement that emerged, and the company posted billions of dollars in losses. And, this is where women founders talk often about how much easier it is for men. Adam Neumann now has a new venture, and he's raised $350 million from Andreessen Horowitz in a round that values his company at more than $1 billion, and they haven't even launched. So the discrimination is real. I think there's about 150 unicorns, which are companies valued at over $1 billion in Southeast and South Asia. And I think India has more than 100 of the unicorns, and there's only one that was founded solely by a woman. So, and Shayon, you talked earlier about studies, and there was one I know that you mentioned actually in your reporting where it was by BCG, and it was based on a survey of 350 startups over a 5-year period that said that women founders received less than half the money that men do. And the study, it ran granular tests. It controlled for education levels and judges' scores at the time of application. It really went into great detail, and there were hundreds of transcripts of pitching sessions that were analyzed that revealed that men actually get asked very different questions from the ones that women do. Men get asked promotion-oriented questions that focus on the business's potential growth, and women usually are subjected to more prevention-oriented questions. And like a man would be asked, how do you plan to monetize this? And he can just sort of share pie in the sky dreams. And women would get asked, how long will it take you to break even? So even the expectations in the sessions, are very targeted based on gender.
Right. I agree. But to be honest, Joey, the things are changing slowly but gradually. I mean, for instance, there are initiatives like Beyond the Billion in the US, which kind of tries to raise dedicated pool of capital to be invested in startups led by women. This particular initiative, for instance, is run by Sarah Chen Spellings and Shelley Porges, and both very influential women. Shelley has worked with the United States government, with Hillary Clinton. Sarah has been venture investor all her life. But when so actually this initiative intends to raise $1 billion for women-led startups. So when they reached out VCs to kind of pledge a part of their corpus, they were shunned. And that kind of says a lot. People who have done this for years, influential, they failed to kind of coax VCs into this. They had to change their strategy. They went to LPs, or people who actually invest in these VC funds. And when it came from LPs, top down, VCs were kind of forced to commit a part of their corpus, or LPs kind of committed the corpus so that they could invest. And the results are astounding. Like, about 800 startups have raised more than 600 million from the Beyond the Billion initiative. And so that kind of says, and 11 of them have gone on to become unicorn startups valued at more than $1 billion. So huge wealth creators as well. There are other people who are also looking, kind of trying to step up. So, for instance, there is Tom Tsao, founder of Gobi Ventures. It's a big fund which has $1.5 billion under management. Tsao told us that they have set up a dedicated fund which will invest in companies founded by women in Indonesia. It's a $10 million fund, which is very small given Gobi's might. But he said he even struggled to convince LPs to commit 10 million into this fund. People are skeptical, but he says it's still a start, and we are all hoping that things change for the better. Because as Henriade told us, this thing about women being conservative in their projections, so on and so forth, actually makes sense for the way the startup ecosystem stands now. We have the past couple of years have been years of fraud valuations, huge amounts of capital pumped into unprofitable businesses. Many startups became unicorns, hundreds of them over the past 2 years across the world. And then now we see the entire world collapsing. A lot of startups, the crypto startups, for instance, laying off hundreds and thousands of people. In India, the biggest edtech unicorn of the world in India, an Indian company called Byju's, laid off more than 5,000 people, huge job losses. There is mayhem everywhere. The general consensus is, conservative estimates, delivering on what you commit, actually makes sense, and things are playing out, justifying what women have been saying all along. That's the right way of doing business.
Thank you, Shayan. And you've also skillfully touched on some of the audience questions which have been coming in, some very good questions about how to promote entrepreneurship by women, and in other words, to address some of these imbalances which have discriminated against women. We are already running quite short of time, and I'm aware that we have a whole discussion on China to have, plus to get to some more audience questions. So Sissy, I'd like to bring you in. The third large piece and the final one in this series was on China, the world's most populous country, and it looked at this fascinating question of how, in some respects, China's moves towards gender parity had gone into reverse. Can you explain to us a bit more about that and what you found?
Yes. So we are quite surprised in our findings that despite China having 2/3 of the world's self-made female billionaires, the gender gap has widened in recent decades in China, as Chinese women's share of labor income and labor force participation rate has been falling since 1990. Which were actually steadily rising in other Asian countries. And we also found that actually the pay gap in China is also widening over the past 3 decades. So one important reason for this is that women were often the first to be fired during the restructuring of state-owned enterprises in early 1990s. And what is worse is in recent years, Chinese state media have been aggressively pushing this propaganda campaign on leftover women, discouraging educated women from working and being too ambitious. So what's worse is China's position in women's political empowerment has been falling since 2010. As you can see, there's not a single woman in China's top political body, which has 24 men. More recently, China's declining birth rate and its aging population is also adding burden to women, particularly that China's encouraging women to give birth to 3 children, which is set to bring more mental and physical burden to women. But the other side of the coin is that China indeed has 2/3 of the world's self-made female billionaires. The reasons are because China has a long history of state-sponsored feminism, mainly because they wanted more workforce to boost its production and economy when the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. So there were a lot of political propaganda slogans back then, and such as women can hold up half the sky, time is different, women are equal to men, and that laid the foundation for women's awareness of gender equality in China. In addition, it's also related to China's economic takeoff, and we should not ignore that. Since the 1990s, and the college expansion policy, which enabled more women to enter college. Because before China's college expansion policy, the rate of the proportion of female students in college was below 30%. And after 2009, the proportion of female students in college has been stabilized around 50%. So lastly, China's infamous one-child policy, which has ironically worked as a double-edged sword, also contributed to a little bit to women's success. Because if a family in China was only allowed to have one child, and that happened to be a girl, the family would tend to invest everything on the girl, and trying their best to send the girls to the college. But if there are more kids in one family, I think some of the Chinese families would prioritize the boys. Yeah, that's some interesting findings of my piece.
Absolutely, and there was so much to get into, and I found this piece really fascinating, Sissy. And were there any particular anecdotes or people in the piece that you that really struck you, that sort of really helped to distill the story in a very kind of human way?
I think there's one case that's really impressed me, is that because I did an interview with the CEO of Trip.com, and she, Jian Sun, and she, is a very successful businesswoman in China, and she was, named by Fortune magazine and as one of the world's top 50 most powerful women in business. And I think her story of success was kind of reflect why China has, has 2/3 of the world's self-made billionaires. She told me during the I would like to use one of her quotes to reflect the one key point in my story. So she said, I think I was very lucky because China opened its door to the world when I was growing up. So I was among the first students to study abroad, and when China took off, I was able to return and build a good company. Yeah, I think that really summarizes why there were so many successful Chinese businesswomen, particularly during particularly from 1990s to early 20,000 or 2000.
Yeah, that's really striking, Sissy, and there's so much more in this piece that we could get into, but I'm very aware that we only have about 10 minutes of the webinar left, and there are some excellent questions from the audience. We won't be able to get to all of them, unfortunately, but there's one here which is a very critical question, I think, and a tough one to answer, but I want to throw it out there. And it's this, it says, in which countries did the accumulation of wealth by women that we looked at happen the fastest? And did this accumulation of wealth lead to better rights and well-being? In other words, is there a link between women earning more and having better lives in society? Dewey, I don't know if the data spoke to that at all.
Yeah, I mean that, it's a very interesting question. I think that one of our findings has been that there is no country that has one uniform story around gender. There is a lot of the superlative span really both ends of the spectrum in a lot of the countries that we looked at. And so, Did we see countries where wealth, collective wealth, has grown rapidly? Do we see a trickle down? Do we see it sort of affecting society as a whole? I think not yet. I think we're still very early stage in the cycle, where, you know, wealth is just starting to grow. More and more women are just starting to come into the workforce. As far as cycles go, we're still very early stage. And so I don't think we're seeing that sort of degree of trickle effect across the society at large. Yet, but you know, what we're covering right now is the seeds of change. It is the start of change, and so hopefully in the decades to come, unless you have countries that go in the other direction, like China, because you see progress based on what happens when you have progress in capitalism, which is birth rates fall and education levels rise and marriage rates fall. Unless you have countries that start reshaping policy to reverse that, hopefully we will see that in the next decades to come.
So that leads very nicely into another question, and we've addressed aspects of this, excuse me, all the way through the event. But it's a crucial question, of course, which is we diagnosed various problems in this series. But what advice would you all, based on your reporting and editing of this series, give to policymakers to support women in their personal and professional advancement? I mean, are there sort of general points which actually, despite cultural differences, are applicable in different countries?
You know, if I could just jump in here really quickly, I think this ties very nicely into the closing piece of the series. The closing piece was an op-ed written by Kathy Matsui, who had come up with the term womenomics, who headed Goldman Sachs Japan for a while. And she talks in the op-ed about what has worked for Japan, what has not worked for Japan, where it succeeded, where it failed, what Asia at large can learn from it, and also what Asia at large needs to do. And she talks in there about policy and what governments need to be doing and what companies need to be doing. And more than advice to women, it really is advice to governments around policy, whether it's equal parental leave for men and women, making sure that Japan, for example, has one of the most generous parental leaves in the world, but a lot of men either don't know about it or just don't take it. So, you know, making people aware of that, mandating that men take it to set the tone of equal caregiving early on, having, you know, family-friendly sort of work policies. She talks about what companies can also do in terms of gender diversity and having mandates on boards, because it's all top down, right? So having mandates, you know, companies, the organizations, the stock indexes, like, you know, to mandate before a company can go public, it needs to have so many women on the board, you know, things like that. And basically she talks about why, you know, diversity should be regarded as a growth strategy, an economic growth strategy, and an investment, you know, rather than an obligation or a cost.
Yes, and points about sort of transparency and appointments on a corporate level. I mean, that's pretty important as well, isn't it? You know, board representation, senior management representation of women.
Yeah, and she also talks a lot about empirical evidence and data that shows how companies with more women on boards or more women in leadership roles actually perform better, how startups with female founders actually perform better. And she talks about the importance of sharing that data, and also of you know, of representation and showing what women are doing and you know, to both men and women around the world, so that there's sort of it perpetuates the thought process around bringing more women in, really to every space.
And then, I mean, aside from the macro policy, that there's also the question of the many women who are, and this is touched on in another question here, who are mentoring and supporting the next generation of women in their fields. It might be very inspiring to hear a couple of those stories. And Sissy, I think you might have one or two examples. Would you mind talking about those?
Sure, yes, I do have. I think based on all my conversations with the successful business women, some suggestions are including like you need to have a female director at the board level. Sometimes it's not that men don't want to do this; it's just that they lack the necessary awareness. So if there's a woman if there's a female director at the board level, and then they could think more for the women, and then they can, they will know better how to, do good things for women. And also, I think those companies, they should really support women after they getting pregnant. And one example I have is that I talked to a company director, and then she said, after she got pregnant, actually her company kept the position for her. And when she got back to work, actually she got promoted. That's because she's really capable. And so, I mean, like from that perspective, a company should really show that what they can do for women after they are pregnant. And lastly, I think now at this stage, a lot of Chinese these companies are going ESG. I think and more people, will have awareness about women empowerment.
Thanks, Sissy.
Can I add an example here in Vietnam? This came up when I was interviewing an Intel executive, because Vietnam is a very important site for the company. It's their biggest chip assembly and testing site in the world. And so Intel set a goal of having, I think it was 40% female engineers, technicians. And what I discussed with the executive was that they make a point of, bringing in high school students, girls, so that they can see female engineers in the lab, at work. They have people to answer questions, be mentors, and just show them that, this is a viable career path. And I thought it was interesting that she brought that up. Because I mean, I became a journalist because I was exposed to this as a teenager, and I think obviously what companies like Intel and others are doing, trying to reach out to people at an early age, obviously makes a big difference. And it sort of reminded me of what I'd been hearing about the sort of origin story of why there's a sort of stereotype of males getting into coding and IT and computer technology in general more than females. And the discussion kind of goes back to the 80s and about the commercials that were coming out at the time, the way that computers were advertised as toys for boys. And so a lot of people think this is the reason that boys got into programming and coding and girls didn't. And so I think those experiences demonstrate the importance of getting people early, and also that a lot of the effects we're living with today are a result of socialization, the social choices that we make.
Thank you, Lian, and that is actually perhaps an excellent note to end with a bit of historical perspective on the progress that has been made, which comes across very strongly in this series, but also the huge amount of work that remains to be done on this question of discrimination, which, as we covered in this series, cuts across fields from sport to finance and everywhere in between. It's been a really stimulating discussion, and I'm really grateful to Dewey, to Lian, Sissy, and Cheyenne, and to you in the audience for your really excellent questions. And I'm sorry for those whose questions I couldn't get to. Hopefully we managed to touch on quite a few of them. Once you've finished, it would be great if you in the audience would consider taking a few minutes, only about 3 minutes of your time, to fill out a short survey to tell us what you're interested in hearing from us, and this will help us choose topics for future events. The link is in the chat box flashing up now, and the QR code on the screen. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today, this evening, wherever you are, whatever time of day it is. And we hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you very much for joining.